Okay, so like, seriously, have you noticed how often mental health comes up in conversation these days?
Hmm.
It's like everywhere you turn, there's another article about ADHD or some celebrity talking about their anxiety.
Right.
And it kind of makes you wonder, are we like overdiagnosing mental illness now?
That's a really interesting question. And you're right. It does feel like it's everywhere you look these days. It's definitely a huge shift from where things were a few decades ago.
Right. Back then, mental health was like this taboo subject, right? People didn't talk about it, and so many people just suffered in silence.
Absolutely.
And now it's like we've swung to the other extreme, from one extreme to the other.
Yeah, it's almost like a pendulum swing, you know?
Totally. It's great that there's less stigma now, but are we maybe going a little too far in the other direction?
That's the big question, isn't it? Have we overcorrected to the point where we're seeing more and more potential overdiagnosis?
Yeah, it's something to think about. And it's not just anecdotal, is it? I mean, we're seeing these huge increases in diagnoses.
That's right.
Like, the CDC reported a 40% increase in ADHD diagnoses just in the last decade, which is wild, right?
Wow.
And anxiety and depression diagnoses are also way up. So is this all just because of increased awareness, or is there something else going on here, do you think?
Well, I think increased awareness is definitely playing a role, and that's a good thing. It means more people are comfortable seeking help, and the stigma is slowly fading.
Definitely.
But it's also worth considering whether we're always getting it right, you know? Like, are we always differentiating between what's a normal human experience and what actually needs a clinical diagnosis?
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's talk about anxiety for a second.
Okay.
Anxiety is totally normal human emotion. We all feel it sometimes, right?
Yeah.
That nervous feeling before a big presentation or like a job interview or something.
Oh, absolutely.
Or even like the excitement before a first date or something. Those are all totally natural responses.
Yeah, totally. So, like, where is the line between that kind of normal anxiety and something more serious, like generalized anxiety disorder?
Well, that's where things can get a little tricky. It's not always super clear cut.
Right.
But with something like generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, it's more than just those fleeting feelings of nervousness, you know? It's this constant excessive worry that's really hard to control, and it seeps into lots of different areas of your life.
So it's like, if I'm stressing about a job interview for a few days, that's probably normal. But if those worries are keeping me up at night, or I can't focus on anything else for weeks, then that might be a sign of something more serious.
Exactly. And it's not just about how strong those feelings are, but also how long they last and how much they're impacting your life.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it's important to remember that anxiety and other mental health challenges exist on a spectrum. So there's a big difference between feeling totally overwhelmed for a little while and having a diagnosable condition that needs professional help.
So it's not just about like whether we feel anxious or sad, right? It's about how much those feelings are actually messing with our lives and how long they stick around for.
Exactly. It's about the impact on our day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
You know, like, can we still function at work, maintain relationships, take care of ourselves, those sorts of things.
Yeah. And that actually makes me think about all the stuff we've been reading about ADHD. How do you tell the difference between a kid who's just like naturally got a ton of energy and one who might actually have ADHD?
Well, that's a great example. And it's something that comes up all the time, especially with kids. I mean, kids are supposed to be kind of all over the place, right? They're fidgety and energetic and easily distracted. That's just part of being a kid.
Totally. So when does that cross the line from like typical kid behavior to something that might actually need a diagnosis?
Well, that's where a really thorough evaluation is super important. You can't just look at a kid's behavior for like an hour and make a judgment call.
Right.
You have to consider their whole developmental history, their family life, how they're doing in school, you know, the whole picture.
So it's really about ruling out other possibilities before jumping to ADHD.
Exactly. I mean, let's say a kid is having trouble in school. That could be ADHD for sure, but it could also be a learning disability, a problem with their vision or hearing that no one's noticed, even something as simple as not getting enough sleep.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There are so many possibilities.
It makes you wonder if maybe sometimes we're so quick to find a solution that we jump to a diagnosis without looking at the bigger picture.
Interesting.
Like, it seems like we live in a world where there's a pill for everything, and we see all these ads for medications that promise to, like, solve all our problems.
You're definitely right about that. The pharmaceutical industry has a huge influence on how we think about and approach mental health.
For sure.
And while medication is essential for a lot of people, it's not a magic bullet, you know. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Absolutely. So how do we make sure medication is being used the right way and not just being handed out like candy for things that might be better addressed with other methods?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
I think it really comes down to taking a more holistic approach to mental health. You know, it's not just about psychiatrists prescribing medication.
Yeah.
It's about therapists, counselors, educators, families, everyone working together to create a supportive environment where people can thrive.
It's like instead of just treating the symptoms, we need to be looking at the whole person.
Exactly. It's about understanding each person's unique experiences and challenges and tailoring their treatment accordingly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about anxiety and ADHD, but what about depression? How do we know the difference between, like, normal sadness, which, let's face it, we all feel sometimes, and actual clinical depression?
That's a really important distinction to make. We all experience sadness and grief and disappointment. They're all normal human emotions. But clinical depression is different. It's more than just feeling down for a little while. It's this persistent sadness, hopelessness, loss of interest in things you used to enjoy. It really takes over your life.
So if you're feeling bummed out after a breakup or, if you lose your job, that's totally normal. But if those feelings drag on for weeks or months and start interfering with your life, that might be a sign that something more serious is going on.
Right. And it's important to remember that depression, like anxiety, can show up in different ways for different people. Some people might withdraw and isolate themselves, while others might become more irritable or agitated.
So it's not always as simple as, like, feeling sad all the time.
Exactly. Depression is complex. It has a lot of different faces, which is another reason why a thorough evaluation is so important.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. It's like we're trying to find this balance between, like, normalizing mental health challenges and at the same time not turning every bad day into a diagnosis,
It's a tough one for sure.
So where do we go from here? How do we navigate all of this and make sure people are getting the help they need without, going overboard and saying that everyone has a problem?
Yeah, no, it's tough for sure. It really does feel like we're walking this tightrope between, like, making it okay to talk about mental health, but then also not acting like every little thing means you need therapy,
It's a tough balance to strike, for sure. And I think it's important to remember that life is stressful. Like, life itself can be overwhelming sometimes, even if you don't have a diagnosed mental health condition.
Totally. And actually, that's what we were calling the overwhelmed by life factor earlier. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Yeah, for sure. I mean, just think about it for a second. We're constantly connected, constantly bombarded with information and social media and pressure to be successful in, like, every single area of our lives.
Yeah.
No wonder so many people are feeling stressed and burnt out, right?
Right. So are you saying, like, some of the things we might see as symptoms of a mental illness could just be signs that we're, like, really stressed out?
Exactly. Think about some of the classic signs of burnout: trouble focusing, feeling tired all the time, not feeling motivated, being irritable, having trouble sleeping. Those can all be symptoms of anxiety or depression too.
Yeah.
So how do we know the difference?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it? So how can someone listening in figure out if what they're dealing with is just like a normal reaction to a crazy world or something that might actually need professional help?
That's where it's so important to be really honest with yourself and do some self-reflection. Like, ask yourself some questions. When did these feelings start? Did something specific happen around that time? Are these feelings constant? Or do they come and go? What makes you feel better? Those sorts of things.
So, like, if you notice that you always feel super anxious after a really chaotic week at work, but then you feel better once you've had a chance to unwind and chill out for a few days, that's probably a good sign it's not necessarily a bigger issue.
Right. Our brains and bodies are incredibly resilient, but they need time to recharge after being under a lot of stress. If those feelings are sticking around even after you've given yourself a chance to rest and recover, that might be when it's time to reach out for help.
And there's no shame in asking for help, by the way. It's a sign of strength, not weakness.
100%. It takes a lot of courage to admit you need support and to reach out for it. And there's so many amazing people out there, therapists, counselors, support groups, who are there to help people who are struggling.
Well, this has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like we've covered so much. We talked about how our view of mental illness has changed over time, how we might be overdiagnosing sometimes, how our crazy, fast-paced world might be playing a role, and the importance of getting help if you need it.
It's been great.
So as we're wrapping things up here, is there one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today?
It's a good question. If I had to pick just one, I think it would be this. Mental health isn't like an on-off switch, It's not that you're
Yeah.
either totally fine or you have a diagnosed mental illness. There's so much space in between. We all experience a whole spectrum of emotions, and those emotions are influenced by a million different things: our genetics, past experiences, the world around us.
It's about finding that balance between like recognizing that it's okay to struggle sometimes, but also not feeling like we need to slap a label on every emotion.
Exactly. Well said. And never forgetting that there is support out there if you need it, and asking for help is a really courageous and important thing to do.
So well said. And that's a perfect note to end on, I think. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. It was really awesome chatting with you.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, if you're feeling overwhelmed or like you need support, please know that you're not alone. Reach out to a mental health professional or a trusted friend or family member. There are people who care about you and want to help. Thanks for tuning in to the deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.